And welcome to another episode of Working the Word. In this series, we're exploring the Gospel of John. Today, we're in chapter 9. You might like to get your Bible and to follow along and just keep an eye on where we're going. See if you see the things that we're seeing there. See what you see that we don't see. This is an interesting one, Annali.
And kind of a little bit of a relief as well. We've had some fairly heavy discourse chapters, and it's a little bit lighter on the discourse this time.
So this time we have the story of a man who was born blind, his healing, and then a prolonged investigation of that healing. This couldn't possibly happen. There has to be another reason. And then just a short discourse from Jesus at the end on spiritual blindness.
I mean, the discourse leads into the next chapter, so this sort of sets that up, but we can only go so far today.
We can. So let's begin at the beginning. As we left off last week, Jesus had upset them in the temple to the extent that they picked up stones and were going to throw them at him.
So he kind of slipped out.
And now it says, and passing by, suggesting he's outside the temple. This man would be there collecting from the worshippers. He'd have a little speech that he would normally use, asking them for a donation. But on this day, he doesn't do it because it's not appropriate to do it on this day. His disciples are watching, and they have a question that maybe is surprising to those of us in the 21st century. The obvious thing, these disciples have been with Jesus for 3 years, to say, oh, that's sad, isn't it? I wonder could we do something for him? But it's not where their head is going.
It's a very Jewish way of thinking, though, that the Pharisaic idea was that, with great suffering came from great sin. So, if you are suffering, then you must have done something to deserve it. And I mean, yes, in some ways that is a very foreign way of thinking for us, because we know that, if you're suffering, your body might actually have, a physical ailment that is affecting it. But at the same time, we still have some people who, particularly in things like, for example, mental illness, if you're suffering from this, then you must have done something to deserve it. And some of that deserving thinking still sort of echoes around some of the corners of Christianity.
And the reincarnation religions. If you're suffering, you must have done something wrong in the last life. And therefore you deserve what you're getting. It would be wrong for us to interfere with the will of God. Mm.
And back here, they even believed that babies could sin in the womb.
we look at that and say, what?
That's a bit problematic, but I mean, this is the way of thinking that they've been raised in. So when they see, for them, it's sort of a curiosity, this man, was it him or his parents? And
to be truthful, there are some sexual sins that can cause blindness. But that's not where they're going. It's a mindset that somebody has to be to blame.
And you've also got that they're philosophizing over suffering. Their response to suffering isn't, how can we alleviate it? It's let's kind of nut it out and figure out who's to blame and work out the theory.
So they're unnecessarily curious rather than compassionate.
And it's maybe not to say that the compassion isn't there, but if they've been raised in a mindset that this is the result of sin, then God might be upset if we intervene too much. Clearly we're supposed to support them and throw a couple coins their way, but as for actually alleviating their suffering and bringing them up out of it, which again, I mean, it's not it's not so foreign today. There's still plenty of Christians who believe that, you know, a lot of the homeless people and people who are struggling and suffering because of poverty and that kind of thing, well, I mean, if they just tried harder, they'd be fine. So
Get a job.
Yeah. Or get a better job or whatever it is, that, you know, some of this thinking still kind of exists, even if it's slightly differently framed.
Made a little more cosmetically. But at the bottom, it's still, we've got to blame somebody rather than how can we show compassion.
And if I can blame you, then, you know, it's your fault. I don't actually have to help. It's not my problem.
And Jesus really takes them off on a different track. He says, neither.
I mean, technically speaking, both this man and his parents sinned, but that was not the cause of this. Just technically speaking.
And does everything have to have a cause? Like if he's blind from birth, it just seems pointless to be even asking the question.
I mean, cause, yes. Whether that cause is sin is another question. But he actually kind of gives a higher purpose to this man. Like if this man's been essentially a beggar, like his entire existence is just relying on the kindness of strangers or neighbours or...
So he's actually bringing kindness out of people.
But Jesus is giving him some dignity as well.
But that the works of God should be displayed in him. It's necessary for us to work the works of the one having sent me. Jesus immediately points them a totally different direction.
And kind of challenges their way of thinking about God. Like if their way of thinking about God is that suffering is, you know, God's judgment on this man for sinning, you know, Jesus talking about doing the work of the one having sent me kind of starts to keeps challenging that notion that they've been raised in of who God is and how he operates.
And the fact that he's the one having been sent, he's giving a picture of the mindset of the Father, which is not, well, he's to blame, his father, mother to blame, but instead, rather than bothering with those questions, let us be doing the works of the one having sent me. And it's interesting, it's let us work the works of the one having sent me. That it's not just what Jesus is doing, it's what the disciples should be doing as well. It's coming into focus.
Well, you've sort of almost got the implication like, while I shall be in the world, I am the light of the world. To me, that feels like there's an implied end of the sentence. Like, while I'm here, I am the light of the world. But when I'm not here...
And Matthew puts that in so many words.
And John doesn't specifically, but you can kind of see the little...
Well, Matthew took Jesus as saying, you are the light of the world. But while he's here, he said, I am the light of the world. And this is a theme that John has had right from chapter 1, where he talked about light and darkness. And he also picked it up in chapter 3. This is the judgment that light has come into the world. And men love darkness rather than the light.
We also had Jesus is the light of the world back in the last chapter, 8 verse 12. Jesus spoke to them again saying, I am the light of the world. The one following me shall not walk in the darkness, but shall have the light of life. And here we've almost got this playing out in like, you know, this is a theory, but this is it playing out in an actual, in front of them. That, you know, this man who has been essentially walking in darkness since he was born has been brought light.
And with light comes seeing. Without light, there is blindness. If you reject the light, then you're in trouble. I remember growing up, we often used to walk on the beach at night. And Dad had a kerosene lamp that we pressure pumped up, and it cast a circle of light, but if you walked outside of that light, what you could see was fairly limited. And Jesus seems to be saying here, look, are you coming to the light or are you going to stay in darkness?
And there's also that he's kind of challenging his disciples to be kind of also carrying that light. That it's like in a lot of the healings, you haven't really had the disciples as an active voice. That it's been Jesus and the person being healed as far as John's accounts. In here, you kind of almost have Jesus starting to onboard the disciples into like, this is the will of the one who sent me. I'm here to do his works, and that's what you're here to do as well.
And the use of us certainly brought that out. And having said that, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to that's the blind man's eyes.
Which, by the way, on modern medical standards, please don't. But at the time, like, the spittle was considered to actually have healing properties.
But if somebody put mud in your eyes, what would you want to do?
Well, there is naturally he's going to go and wash it off anyway. It's not a massive leap of faith for him. It's like, well, I've got to wash. But with one of the other issues is that, like, the making clay involves the kneading, which is against Sabbath rules, and that, like, the spittle being considered to have healing properties, like it itself wasn't. Jesus could have just spoken, and he was healed. But Jesus actually kind of gave him something to engage with, like a remedy that was conceptually accessible to him. Because, if this is considered to have healing properties, he's actually given us a way that he can physically engage in this healing, as opposed to just kind of a cadabra kind of healing.
But as the man leaves Jesus, he is still a blind man. Nothing that Jesus has done to this point has healed him. But Jesus does say, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And we mentioned the pool of Siloam a couple of weeks ago when Jesus said, I am the water of life.
And it was sort of the ritual.
Yeah, the priest went from the temple down around to the pool of Siloam, got some water, brought it back and was poured out around the altar. A symbol of the Spirit bringing new life.
And having this washing is kind of a choice to engage with that. I also find it interesting that John adds the note which means sent, or one of the other options for, how it's translated is the one who is sent. And just like John just kind of adds these little things in, but I mean, he went and washed.
And he came, there's that play, he went and he came, seeing. So how was he healed? All we know is that he went blind and he came back seeing.
And I mean, this is the question that bugged the Pharisees for like the entire rest of the chapter. But the other thing, like there's a couple of practical advantages in that by the time the miracle itself actually happens and the guy starts being able to see, Jesus is not round. Jesus is sort of, out of play. Like they've just been trying to stone him. It's kind of not necessarily a bad idea for Jesus to be making himself scarce. Like he's still, engaging with and helping people. But he's not...
He's moved on and the man has come back seeing.
And he's not the centre of attention.
But the neighbours, this is a closed neighbourhood. And those having seen him before, like if he's been blind from birth, he's been here for a while. They've seen him before, that he was a beggar, are saying, is this not he who was sitting and begging? Well, what's the obvious thing to do? But instead...
I think it's kind of funny, though, that, like, he's been sitting there for probably years.
Mm-hmm.
And no one has paid enough attention to him to be able to tell if it's him or not.
And that's a telling commentary.
And, like, I mean, I don't necessarily think this is something we can even really look down on them because, you know, that it's really, really easy to keep walking past people and never actually see them, particularly if they're, you know, one of the other, if they're disabled, if they're, you know, if homeless, if there's something that makes them sort of different to me, it's really easy to kind of just keep looking past and not seeing. And here we see it in that, yes, they've been looking past him so often that they can't actually recognize if the man is the man.
They've thrown a coin or two.
And never really seen him, but they don't ask him. Like, he's sort of like sitting, like, I'm here, like, it's me. But, you know, again, consistently, particularly things like disability or homeless or whatever, people talk above you. And, you know, this would have been his experience a lot. Like, you know, it makes you feel good to throw a couple coins his way, but, you know, you don't actually sit down and spend time with the guy.
And some are saying, it's he. But others are saying, no, but he is like him.
The powers of attention or lack of.
All the while he keeps saying, and the he is supplied, you know, I am. It's actually the one that Jesus has been using. And John puts it here in this man's expression. You know, it is me. But who believes? You know, this expression, some were saying, but others, is one that's been common in John up till now.
John's pretty consistent with that, though. He almost, in terms of giving his reader space, like whichever side of the fence you're falling down at this moment, there is somebody in the story who represents you that, you know, you can kind of move in amongst the story because either way, you know, you're in there somewhere.
So we've seen it in quite a few of the chapters. Back in chapter 7, there were some who were saying, he's good, but others were saying he deceives the people. Some were saying, this is the Christ. Others were saying, surely the Christ doesn't come out of Galilee. Here, it's he. No, but he is like him. And we're going to come across that again when we get down to verse 16. So,
and I think, like, given that, you know, John sort of states at the end, this is written that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and believing you may have life in his name. It's kind of like John is giving us a, like, here is the evidence. Here's, like, you know, giving you the opportunity and the information to choose.
But sometimes we come up with facts that are uncomfortable to our worldview. And what I see happening in this story is people who are seeing the facts, but they are uncomfortable with the logical implications of the facts. And as a result, are coming up with all kinds of theory as to why it can't possibly be so, rather than say, isn't this wonderful? We rejoice with you.
The thing is, it was threatening the direct power structures of, like, if this is true, then there's a whole bunch of other things that have to be dealt with, and that's a problem.
Like who Jesus is, which has been John's theme the whole way. And so they were saying to him, and, you know, it's an ongoing thing, how were your eyes opened?
Which is interestingly passive.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how many times the word how comes up.
And I mean, it's kind of a little bit human nature. Like, this guy was blind and then just he's not. Like, how? What happened?
Mm-hmm. Well, he does have an answer. The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes. And he said to me, go to Siloam and wash. Therefore, having gone and having washed, I received sight.
Again, quite passive. Like in terms of I received sight, it wasn't, he healed me or anything. It was, I received it.
Well, how can you pin this healing on Jesus? Jesus wasn't there when he got his sight back. Jesus was well away when he got his sight back. But that passive, I received sight. And the obvious question is, well, where is he? Would the blind man recognise him if he saw him?
Also, by Jesus being away, like he is genuinely being, I don't know where he is. Like if he'd known where he was, the Pharisees may have gotten a little heavy-handed trying to get that information out of him, but he genuinely didn't know.
And so he truthfully could say, I don't know. So they is the people.
The neighbours.
The neighbours and the people who had seen him blind.
It tends to be like, because the way that communities were so close-knit, if there was a risk that something was going to kind of go, like, the community knows the Pharisees' opinions and plans for Jesus. And, they know that anybody associating with this man is deemed risky. So if they bring this guy to the Pharisees first, it insulates them a little bit against the, like, see, we reported it, we brought it in, we're good people, don't excommunicate us kind of thing.
Or this one's too hard for us, let's bring it to someone who is more informed in these religious matters. And here we have a complicating factor, at least in the eyes of those present. The day in which Jesus healed the man, made the clay, opened his eyes, was Sabbath.
And I mean, it's kind of been one of the bugbears all the way along that Jesus doesn't follow Sabbath the way, for them, I think it was a couple hundred years BC, they were invaded by someone, I don't remember who, on the Sabbath, and 1,000 people died because it was Sabbath and they refused to defend themselves. If your house was burning down on a Sabbath, you couldn't really carry any stuff out. The only way you could get stuff out was to go in, put a piece of clothing on, wear it out, take it off, go in, put a piece of clothing on. That's the only way you could legally get any of your stuff out on Sabbath. There's a massive collection of rules as to how this is to be followed. And Jesus is really, really not interested in following them that way. And
back in chapter 5, the man at the pool of Siloam that Jesus said, get up, walk. Take
your mat.
was the Sabbath. So there's no question here about what day the Sabbath was, but there's certainly a question about
what was permissible.
What was permissible. And maybe Jesus should have made an appointment and said, look, come and see me in the morning and we'll...
And the guy's been blind his whole life.
Mm-hmm.
As far as we know, he's not in pain, he's not in mortal danger. It's, if it waits till tomorrow, that will be fine.
Just one day more.
One day more. And he wouldn't have known any different because he didn't actually approach Jesus. Jesus approached him.
Jesus didn't even ask his permission. But again, the Pharisees have got the question, how did you get your sight back? And he's very plain. He said to them, he put clay in my eyes, I washed, I see.
Again, we've got these two viewpoints.
This time the Pharisees have two viewpoints. Some of the Pharisees are saying, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath.
And I mean, the Pharisees, the Sabbath was kind of their thing. Mm-hmm. Out of all the things that they believed and followed and taught, the Sabbath was kind of the key one. If you messed up the Sabbath, that was the big. If you messed up, some of their groups sort of consistently had little ways of getting around some of the rules, but in terms of the rules they held people accountable to, Sabbath was the biggest.
Well, 600 years before this, some of their ancestors had gone into Babylonian captivity because they neglected the Sabbath. And now these ones have gone to the other extreme. And you don't lift a finger, you don't do anything on Sabbath. Whereas Sabbath in the Old Testament seems to be a day of mercy, a day of showing kindness. But they've lost that. So some of them are saying that, he can't possibly be from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath how we think it should be kept. But others are saying, how is a sinful man able to do such signs?
And there was division among them. I feel like this is an understatement because, like, with how important this isn't going to be sort of, well, I don't agree with you, but I respect your right to, like, this isn't going to be that kind of Sabbath is the thing. This is salvation. This is, the very pinnacle. If they mess this up, then God will be angry and send them into captivity again. This is not a thing you can just kind of casually agree to disagree.
Luke would put it, there was no small dispute between them. And so they again say to the blind man, what do you say concerning him? For he opened your eyes.
Which I find is interesting because they're actually asking, if he's been blind, his ability to get a standard education is going to have been limited.
Mm-hmm.
They're essentially asking him for an informed theological opinion here and asking as though what he says matters.
Well, he says something. He says, he's a prophet.
Therefore, the Jews did not believe.
What do you do when you come up with facts that don't fit with where you want the world to be? It's challenging. Well, if the facts don't fit, then you've got to go to an alternate set of facts. And so the Jews, it says, did not believe concerning him that he had been blind. And, come on, he can't have been blind. And we can't believe that he's been healed like that. And we don't want to give Jesus that sort of cred. He mustn't have been blind.
There has to be another explanation, and that seems to be the next sort of most logical.
Let's see what reasons we can find so that we don't have to believe that this really happened. So they called the parents of the man who had received his sight.
Kind of find this incident interesting as well because you've essentially got the parents choosing their community over their kid.
Mm-hmm.
It specifically says, his parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jews.
Mm-hmm. Well, they did answer some questions, Is this your son, of whom you say that he was born blind? Then how does he see? And the parents are cautious.
They're kind of cagey, we know this is our son, yes.
We know that he was born blind, yes.
But we're staying out of the rest of it.
How he sees? We don't know. Who opened his eyes? We don't know. Ask him, he's old enough. He can speak for himself.
And I kind of find it interesting because at this point we've had, witness has been one of the things that's been a bugbear that the Pharisees have had. Here at this point, they have the witness of the neighbours, they have the witness of the man himself, they have the witness of his parents.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not...
But if you don't want to believe, all of that's going to make no difference at all.
But you've kind of had this, the Pharisees going, you're testifying concerning yourself, that doesn't count. Here we have three distinct sets of testimonies, all leading to the same conclusion, and it still doesn't count.
And Jesus is not among it. But his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, and this is not the first time.
To be fair, though, like, you know, we get the Jews had agreed together that if anybody should confess in Christ, he would be expelled from the synagogue. And that's not just sort of, you know, tossed out of the building this one week. Like the severe social and economic even implications for being tossed out of the synagogue. Like, yes, it seems a little bit cowardly from the whole, you know, this is your kid, maybe stand up for him sort of thing. But, you know, given the context, that carries a lot of loss.
And we saw it back in chapter 7, that some were saying he's great and others were saying he's a deceiver, but no one was speaking publicly because of the fear
of the Jews.
Because they had agreed, if you say this is the Messiah, you're out on your neck.
Which I think also makes it really interesting how this guy is really quite so bold.
Maybe he doesn't know as much. He's just been overlooked.
I kind of tend to think not, because the sort of way that he responds, it's not as a guy who's just an idiot. Like, you know, if he's been sitting outside the temple begging, he's probably going to have heard what went on. He'll know this. And the way he responds to me suggests that he knows that. But having been in the position in society he's been in, where there hasn't really been any particular concern for helping or elevating him as a, you know, disabled person, essentially, I think he's a lot less invested in the system. Like he's already been an outlier on the community. And now the Pharisees are kind of trying to make him change his story so he can be an in guy. And I think he's like, you know, I'm not invested enough in this community to be willing to sacrifice what I know.
And what I've experienced. So they pull him in a second time. And it's interesting to speculate, is this the same day? Is this the Sabbath, or is a little bit of time elapsed?
I suspect, personally, a little bit of time. Just because of the extensiveness of this trial. Like, we know that the healing itself happened on Sabbath. But, like, John says it like, you know, now the day in which Jesus had made the clay and opened his eyes was a Sabbath. So to me, it kind of sounds like it could be, you know, that was a Sabbath, implying that this investigation is happening post.
And I see it that knowing the hypocrisy that happened, they were so down on Jesus' healing, but they were quite into doing destructive things.
But we've also got the neighbours and the parents. And, like, it's one thing to kind of convene a full trial. It's another thing to involve other witnesses.
Well, who knows? But they call a second time, bring the blind man in, give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner.
I kind of find this a little bit funny because it's give glory to God, now change your story and lie. But, like, you know, they're coming from a conclusion. Like, we know this man is a sinner, so you have to be lying, so change your story.
Which is interesting because in the last chapter, Jesus asked the question, which of you convinces me of sin? And they kept quiet.
The thing is, he's not actually here to defend himself at this point. And it tends to be when they challenge him. He seems to keep coming out on top, whereas here, he's not here to keep coming out on top. They can say it.
Okay, so you've got a man who's just been blind, who has an answer like, whether he's a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that being blind now, I see.
Which is watertight. Like, there's nothing they can do with that. That, you know, he's not getting into their games. He's not getting into the intrigue. He's just going, look, this I know. I don't know about all of this. This I know. Which to me, I actually think he was reasonable. Like, he'd been overhearing some fairly serious conversations from the temple, and he was relatively up on things because I think he knew the kind of answer he was giving here. Like, I'm not giving you ammunition here. I'm not commenting on the sinner stuff. I'm not going to get into that battle, but I know this is my experience. I was blind, now I see.
And that's a very good...
There's not much you can say to that. And you can tell they know, and they're starting to kind of grasp.
A person who has an experience is never going to be at loss with a person who has an argument.
So they kind of try and find a loophole again.
Yeah. What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?
I kind of find that his response may be a little bit snarky, just a tiny bit. Like, I told you already and you didn't listen. Why do you...
How did he open your eyes? Jesus didn't open his eyes.
But, like, they're deliberately trying to get around and get the evidence they're looking for.
Of Sabbath-breaking.
And this, again, he's just not having it. I told you already and you didn't want to hear. Why do you want to hear again? Do you want to be his disciples too?
Oh, that's a low blow.
Like, as far as, you know, a disabled guy off the street who is now toe-to-toe with the religious leaders and staring them down? Dang.
And all they can do is throw insults at him.
It gets personal. And, like, you know, he has clearly won the logic battle. Mm-hmm. There is no doubt in their minds about that. So basically all they can do is try and discredit his reputation and toss him out.
And I've experienced that. When you're in a debate and somebody starts to throw insults your way and call you names, put labels on you, you know they've run out of arguments. You know you've won. It's
not a particularly strong position if you've got to resort to that.
Mm-hmm. But how common it is that you put a label on something rather than dealing with the issue.
Though I also kind of find it interesting that, like, this man at this point, you know, we're going to find out, doesn't actually really know a whole lot. So he's sticking up, like, really, like, he's sticking his neck out there for something he doesn't know much about the details. All he knows is, I was blind, now I see. That's enough. And the implication of, do you wish to become his disciples also? Kind of almost indicates that, you know, when they say you're a disciple of that one, he's just kind of almost already said that. Mm-hmm. Like, do you want to join in? And that, you know, they're sort of, you know, we are disciples of Moses.
So we will do anything to avoid admitting.
I also kind of find it interesting here. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but we do not know where this man is. I'm sorry, 2 chapters ago, a prophet doesn't come from Galilee. I mean...
They were quite certain back then.
Like, there was twice. Very specifically, the unbelief of the Jewish leaders right at the end, just in snarking back to Nicodemus. Like, are you not also from Galilee? Search and see that a prophet is not raised out of Galilee. They know where he's from. Mm-hmm. They're not using their thinking brains right now.
That they've lost their rational thought because they want to stick in a position of unbelief.
And I think that continues to remain to be a risk, though, because some people kind of conceive faith as this thing that, like, you can have rational logic or you can have faith. The two are not interchangeable. Like, they can't mingle. Whereas if your faith requires you to check your logic at the door, then I would... The red flags, major red flags.
Mm-hmm. That God never asks us to believe without giving us sufficient evidence upon which to base our faith. For evidence that appeals to our reason.
And, like, you know, if your reason is going out the door, then there's some troubling implications on faith. And I think that even now, some of the things where, like, you know, this is the faith position we think, so all the logic stuff just has to kind of, like, we accuse science of doing it, but faith does it as well. Faith does it just sort of the opposite same thing.
And a geologist a few years ago, accused some Christians of telling lies for God. Wrote a book by that name. And on what he was on, he was right. And the man's response to this is one that you and I have wondered about the tone of voice.
I think it's snark. I mean, not heavy snark. He is still toe-to-toe with like the power, but he's toe-to-toe with the power structures. And you don't kind of, I don't think you can kind of withstand an extended face-to-face looking them in the eye and be able to sort of answer this strongly and powerfully and not in any way afraid of them without there being just a little bit of like, are you guys for real? Like, you know, this is amazing thing that you do not know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes.
And I sort of saw it a little bit stronger. That's amazing. You don't know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes. You know, we know that God doesn't hear sinners. But if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears him. He has been listening.
Oh, yeah. And they're not impressed that he's been listening.
Never out of the age. You know, it hasn't happened before. Has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of one having been born blind? If this man were not from God, he could do nothing.
I mean, if this man hadn't been born blind and had been raised, like, you know, in the full-on proper Jewish education school, like, he'd be a force to be reckoned with.
He's got good theology.
And, like, just his fearlessness. Like, he's not just kind of, you know, doing what he needs to do to stay safe or, you know, pandering to them like everybody else did to sort of, you know, try and keep his standing in the community. He's face-to-face, toe-to-toe, staring them in the eye and talking them down.
Well, he's just been blind and he knows he can see now.
He's not backing down.
And neither are they.
But again, it goes into personal insults. Like, again, his logic checks out.
They were asking his opinion before as if they would take it. They don't like his answers.
And the implication of, you know, you were born entirely in sins.
And you're going to teach us?
Which sort of implies that, you know, do you teach us? Maybe he was being more of a teacher in that moment than they were.
And they are not comfortable with that. And so they kick him out. Get out.
To be honest, it might have been one of the best things they did for him. Because, I mean, you know, if you have to deny your own experience, who you are, what you've, like, I was blind, now I see, to be part of the
And they're saying, no,
group.
you weren't blind. Oh, the witnesses say, yes, he was. And apparently he's seeing perfectly well.
And, you know, the cost of being in this community is too high for him. And the other thing is, it's one of the few times we sort of get a little bit of glimpse in that they cast him out and Jesus hears and comes find him again.
So at this point, Jesus re-enters the story. We haven't seen Jesus since he put the mud in his eyes.
And it's kind of actually, as far as the John stories go, it's a fairly Jesus-light story. Like, Jesus kind of shows up, put mud in his eyes and shows up for the end credits kind of thing. There's like, all of this takes place completely outside Jesus's realm. It's not Jesus who's standing up and kind of, you know, staring them down. Now this ex-blind guy,
even a blind man can,
is standing up staring them down.
But still they are resisting believing, despite the evidence.
Well, but the thing is, for them, the blindness isn't the lack of evidence. It's very much a choice that, you know, they've had sufficient evidence for legally, you know, their legal processes to be satisfied, just not their emotional ones.
So Jesus comes to the blind man who doesn't recognise him.
He was blind last time, to be fair.
And maybe his sense of hearing goes down now that his vision comes up.
I don't know so much that. I think it's like there's a whole bunch of sensory information that he hasn't been accustomed to getting. And like, to me, the fact that Jesus hears that they've cast him out and goes to find him is sort of a key thing that it's worth sort of noting, that sometimes when the religious people toss you out, it's not that God has abandoned you, because Jesus comes looking for him. And like, you know, he asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? The KJV translates that as the Son of God, but the Son of Man is this one. Now, he's been healed, but this guy is, you know, it's not so much, I don't know who, like, I think he would have recognized, you know, the voice of the guy who talked to him. But his response is, you know, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?
So he wants to believe.
It's so like, yeah, I'm here, like, sign me up, just where?
Which is such a contrast to the attitudes of the leadership.
And like, he's ready to sign up and believe without, like, yes, he's had the personal, he was blind, now he can see.
But now he's being asked to follow a person.
But it kind of, he's ready to sign up without really having read the fine print. It's just like, what I have experienced is enough, sign me up. Where? Who? What? Tell me.
And so Jesus is simple. You've seen him. He's the one speaking to you.
The man connects the dots and says, I believe, Lord, and worshipped him. Like, out of all of the people we've encountered, this guy's probably the easiest, like, yeah, okay, I'm in.
And so I'm believing, but I'm also down on my knees. Because it says, and he worshipped him for who he was.
And I think this is another one of the points where John is drawing these differentiations, because you've got the Pharisees who are you know, you don't fit our picture of what we want you to say. We're throwing you out of the worship group. And this guy who's sort of spontaneously worshipping with very little, you know, he hasn't been trained in this. He hasn't done his Bible studies. He just sort of, I'm in. And you've kind of got that contrast, because for them, Sabbath is about worship. You know, if you're breaking the Sabbath, it's a worship issue. And yet they're very staunchly refusing to worship the one who the Sabbath kind of points to. But this guy is, sign me up.
And it's at this point that Jesus comes to maybe his one sentence summing up. For judgment I came into this world, that those not seeing may see, and those seeing may become blind.
I almost wonder if just a tiny bit the disciples are included in this as well, because this whole story started with them going, you know,
who sinned?
Who sinned? Who do we judge here? Who do we blame?
Which says they were blind.
And, you know, Jesus is sort of like, for judgment I came into the world, but this is what my judgment is.
That God will give you the evidence that you need to believe. And depending on what you do with what God enlightens you with.
I think it's Matthew has he who has ears, let him hear. Like, it's from an Old Testament thing, but like this, that hearing is not necessarily listening, believing. And we've sort of got, you know, that just with a different sense here, that you know, they have seen everything. Like in the next verse, we've got some of the Pharisees who were with him, which amuses me because they're looking for him, and yet
they're still around.
There's some sort of, I don't know, undercover or something. I don't know, but they're looking for him, and yet they just sort of happen to be nearby. But they've seen everything that everybody else has seen.
And they can't help themselves. You know, out it comes. Are we also blind? Again,
maybe it's just me, but I feel like there's a little bit of snark from the Pharisees. Like, what, are you calling us blind too?
And I think Jesus.
And Jesus' response is like they were kind of expecting him to say yes, but they didn't. They weren't keen. And the way he says yes, again, is kind of do you see yourself here? Mm-hmm. Because he doesn't say yes. He said, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains. Like, it's a conditional.
Mm-hmm. If. If and since.
If you didn't know any better, then you would have no sin. But you know better.
I've shone the light in front of you. And you have closed your eyes. And there's none so blind as those who will not see.
And it's just like, again, it's almost like a trap that he's setting for them. Not so much in he's trying to trap them per se, but like giving them a response that by way of them understanding what his response is, they kind of have to understand their part in it.
It's a yes without a put down. It's an open-ended yes that doesn't say you're blind, period. But you're not seeing. You're coming up with all sorts of excuses not to believe. And believing, it seems to me, is what we choose to do with the facts.
And I think there's also an element to which it's an ongoing thing to continually just sort of keep in the back of your mind and reflect, because since you say we see, like we know truth, we know whatever it is, like these are the things we know and we believe. If we're saying we see and continuing to not act though we're seeing, the seeing itself isn't the thing. It's what you're doing. And because they've got, they're sort of, we see, we know, their sin remains because they're not, they're judged according to what they see.
And from here, Jesus is going to go into an extended discourse.
Oh, that's not like Jesus at all.
He's going to talk about the Good Shepherd. He's going to talk about the unbelief of the Jews. He's going to talk about John the Baptist, but we're going to save that for next week's episode, when we continue in our study of the Gospel of John, and we hope that you can join us again next week as we continue to look at the Gospel of John, so that we may believe, so that we may know who Jesus is. We invite you to join us again then.